Good evening and welcome to the Hacks and Wonks post-primary election recap. I'm Crystal Fincher. I'm a political consultant and the host of the Hacks and Wonks podcast. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by three of my favorite Hacks and Wonks to break down what happened in last week's primary election. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish peoples, past and present. I would like to honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. We're excited to be able to live stream this recap on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Additionally, we're recording this recap for broadcast on KODX and KVRU radio podcast, and it will be available with a full text transcript at officialhacksandwonks.com. We invite our audience to ask questions of our panelists. If you're watching a live stream online, then you can ask questions by commenting on the live stream. You can also text your questions to 206-395-6248. That's 206-395-6248, and that number will scroll at the bottom of the screen. Our esteemed panelists for the evening are E.J. Juarez. E.J. is a public servant who remains involved in numerous political efforts across Washington. In his day job, he's the Director of Equity and Environmental Justice for the Department of Natural Resources. He leads that agency's work to reduce health and economic disparities through environmental justice practices. He previously served as the first public policy manager for the Group Health Foundation, where he led the work to create that organization's political and legislative portfolio after serving in leadership posts at the Seattle Library and as the executive director at Progressive Majority and Color PAC, organizations dedicated to recruiting, training, and electing progressive champions in Washington and Oregon. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. And next we have Doug Trum. Doug is the executive editor of The Urbanist and serves on the Urbanist Elections Committee, which crafts the organization's endorsements. An Urbanist writer since 2015, he dreams of pedestrianizing streets, blanketing the city in bus lanes, and unleashing an eco-friendly mass timber building spree to end the affordable housing shortage and avert our coming climate catastrophe. He graduated from the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. He lives in East Fremont and loves to explore the city by bike, foot, or bus. Welcome, Doug Trum. Great to have you. So we are having a little bit of technical difficulties with Doug. He will join us back again as soon as he's able, but we'll get started with E.J. Juarez. Starting off, I think we can start with the congressional races, where just yesterday in the 3rd Congressional District, which is in Southwest Washington, we saw Jamie Herrera Beutler concede. And so Joe Kent, the Republican, is finishing in second place in the primary, proceeding to go to the general election against Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, who is the Democrat in that race and finished first. What did you see happening in this? Did you expect Joe Kent to make it through? And what does this mean for what this race is going to look like in the general election?
So I'll be honest and say no. I did not expect Joe Kent to make it through. I think I had more faith in Southwest Washington, honestly. This is a situation where I think conventional wisdom had most of the energy focused on Jamie. How were folks going to make the case that Jamie needed to be replaced? And unfortunately for Jamie, that meant everybody was really against her. And the results proved that. My big concern moving forward, and I think things that I'm going to be watching for is this a Democratic operation in that district that can pull through and actually deliver a field strategy that can deliver on the fundraising and the hopes of the strategy of what the national Democrats have been doing is, supporting these Trump conspiracy theorists over more moderate candidates in the hopes that Democrats pull through and take them out in the general. This is one where it's really going to be, is Nancy Pelosi's strategy going to play out the way they hope?
Yeah, this is going to be really interesting. There was a lot of late money that came in support of Jamie Herrera Beutler. There was a lot of talk that she wasn't very visible throughout the end of that campaign, and so that may have had something to do with it. But I think the GOP electorate is pretty fractured. And this is one, we'll talk about several others coming up, but one of a number of races where the party establishment made it known what their preference was, put resources and a big push behind their candidates, and it actually didn't quite land. Their voters said, that's actually not our choice, and went a different direction. And Jamie Herrera Butler has been known as, it's interesting to say moderate Republican, but more moderate than her counterparts, I think is fair. She had that reputation, but had been pushed further to the right, kind of in response to where the base is this time, but not far enough. Joe Kent is in the race. He's Trump endorsed. He is a frequent guest on the Sean Hannity program. He thinks that Jim Jordan should take over as leader of the party in place of Kevin McCarthy. He said that he's going to immediately call for Joe Biden's impeachment and investigate the 2020 election. He does not believe in support for Ukraine, defended calling President Zelensky a thug, just has a number of beliefs that seem like they aren't in line with where the GOP has traditionally been, certainly different than where the majority of residents in the state are, if you look at all available polling. But he cobbled together a coalition that made it through the primary. Do you think that Republicans are going to coalesce behind him, Doug?
I think ultimately they will. And I guess it depends, how many people are dyed in the wool Republicans in that district, because I think the sort of structural problem maybe that the state GOP is running into is just that the more they make their sort of brand true to that base that elected Joe Kent, the less that they're appealing to the sort of swing independent voters. So I don't know. I don't know what to make. I think Republicans ultimately might come home, but they might lose a few folks who are just like disgusted about the whole thing about her losing her seat. But I mean, it seems like there's been an incredible amount of brand loyalty throughout, a near coup. So I don't know when to expect a huge exodus, but just a little bit of bleeding in that district could end up being costly.
Do you think they're going to be able to effectively moderate EJ?
I'm going to go with no. I'm sitting here thinking of what it must be like to be a Republican who shows up to your county Republican meeting, right? In this moment where you have such dissatisfaction, both with your options, your party apparatus and strategy, where literally there is no consensus. And when we talk about how are Republicans going to activate their base, I'm not convinced Republicans know who their base are in this moment. And it shifts in every district based on every candidate. And the lack of consistency there, one, makes their money less effective, right? You're not operating in scale, and you're not operating with the mass kind of penetration that you can get when you have a consistent messaging strategy that is born out of multiple cycles of races. So I think it's messy, and I think that this race in particular really is a great illustrative moment for what happened in the legislative races and what we're seeing across Washington state right now, where you cannot get Republicans on brand, which is so wild to me given the past 30 years of rigid brand management.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to be very interesting to see just how that turns out. And, I've certainly been asked recently, well, Joe Kent is a different kind of Republican, not the traditional kind of Republican we've seen elected here in Washington state. Does that mean that Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez has a chance to win this race? This is a district where Jamie Herrera Butler previously won it with 56% of the vote, I believe it was. Donald Trump won it with just under 51% to Joe Biden's around 48%. So this is certainly a district that at least leans Republican, if not more. Does the Democrat have a shot, do you think, Doug?
Absolutely. I mean, I a lot of race still happen, but I would not be feeling confident if I was just assuming that was going to be a safe R seat. Just the impact of that particular issue. And I mean, Jamie Herrera Butler's been there a long time, so I'm sure there's some loyalists who are a little bit offended that, you know, that's how her career ended. So I don't know. It's just, like you said, it's messy, and you know, the brand is kind of it's just murky right now, and it's so much of it's driven just by anger and sort of backlash. That's a very crude tool to wield. It's effective, I mean, in motivating people, but you don't know which direction they're going to go. And if just the conservative media apparatus is just, it's completely runs on that type of thing, and it you know, it's kind of unwieldy.
I'll just jump in briefly. I agree with Doug. I think the challenge here is that in any other year, if you were going to look at the Democrat in that race and say you pulled less than 34%, that's not a good number to build from. And that's a really tough place to find a strategy and a foothold. I think that given the uniqueness of the challenger who's making it through to the general, it kind of throws that playbook out. And we're going to see over the next month, I think these next 30 days are going to be really telling over just how much get up and go those local Democrats have in order to make up those percentages.
I agree. And so we'll move to the 8th congressional district race, which is a bit further north, parts of a few different counties, including King County, that saw Kim Schreier, who is the current incumbent Democrat, finish with a pretty strong result, and had some strong challengers in terms of Republicans who were duking it out. So you had Reagan Dunn, Matt Larkin, and Jesse Jensen all competing on the Republican side, with Matt Larkin making it through. What do you make of this result, EJ? And what do you think it says about where Republicans are at, even in King County?
I think it says a lot about Reagan Dunn. I really do. I think that to be perhaps the most high-profile Republican in King County, and maybe in that entire district, and have that showing, really shows, you know, I think it says a lot about both his candidacy and viability for further office, but ultimately his track record and what he's been able to accomplish. Matt Larkin, a relatively unknown Republican coming in, being able to beat a sitting county council member in this contested primary, definitely, you know, bad news for establishment Republicans in this moment.
Certainly not what a lot of people predicted. What do you think the general election is going to look like in this race, Doug?
It does have the makings of a squeaker. I mean, you know, when I was looking on election night, you know, I was optimistic, and I think, if I'm recalling correctly, Kim Schreier's lead's just kind of eroded a little bit, and maybe that's just the rural parts of the district are seeing less of that traditional King County progressive swing at the end. But you know, she still does have, I think, the upper hand, and you know, with the higher profile candidate not making it through, again, you kind of have the case of, is the party gonna be really excited and get behind Larkin the way they may have for Dunn as sort of the anointed, you know, dynasty son or whatever. And you know, it just goes to show you again, like, they're just having a really hard time picking candidates in the way that they easily used to kind of anoint the successor and get a candidate through who had all the connections and all the money. Larkin might find that with this sort of being a high profile race for control of the House, but you know, it certainly isn't what they planned.
Does not appear to be what they planned. And it seems like Reagan Dunn and Jesse Jensen were really concerned with going after each other and not really paying attention to Matt Larkin, it seemed, or at least he seemed to duck a lot of the crossfire going back and forth. Do you think that might have contributed to him making it through, just that he wasn't in between the whole mudslinging battle?
Yeah, that seems to be the case. And Reagan Dunn was just doing so much to sort of try to rebrand himself, and maybe that just wasn't a great idea, because, you know, a lot of the King County Republicans sort of tried to make this moderate brand that they thought would be, you know, and probably that would play better in the county. But then knowing that he had this primary, suddenly he's, you know, taking these votes where he's reaffirming he's, you know, anti-abortion, anti-choice, and taking these county council votes where, if you wasn't in the race, you feel like you might have voted differently. And I don't know if voters also just kind of react negatively, that kind of like figure to the win kind of opportunism. Just be yourself sometimes can get you some points that being a little too smart by half might actually cost you.
Yeah, I think so. I think this was interesting. Also, the Senate race with Tiffany Smiley and Patty Murray was interesting. And that, especially this 8th congressional district race, was one that Republicans really thought was, they were going to have, I think, certainly a stronger showing than this, that they were expecting Kim Schreier to be a little bit more vulnerable than she turned out to be. And looking at some of these other races where they thought, hey, these are big opportunities for pickups. And not only did it not turn out very well percentage-wise, but their preferred candidates didn't even make it through. I think both of you alluded to some of the message discipline challenges that they're having. And a lot of times we've talked about, hey, Democrats' messages are, may have some issues and stuff. They seem to actually be pretty effective. The Democratic results were fairly strong compared to what expectations were going in, and Republicans seem to struggle. And you just talked about Reagan Dunn having a challenge with talking about where he's at in terms of abortion rights. He before had, tried to be a moderate. This time it seemed like he really initially and kind of in the middle there felt like he needed to say, yeah, absolutely, I'm pro-life. I personally don't believe in abortion and don't want that. And with the Dobbs decision, Republicans could say that before, certainly more than a few had. I don't think that Washington residents feeling that they had protections federally, plus in the state, really felt like there was a vulnerability. And so kind of just let that slide. I don't think that was the case this time. And I heard Reagan Dunn in one interview say, yeah, that happened federally, but here in this state, abortion is settled law, which is literally what we heard Justice Kavanaugh say, what we heard a number of Congress people say before that right was eliminated at the federal level. So there just isn't confidence or comfort that that is settled law. And it seems like Republicans are a bit flat-footed and realistically just not in step with the 65 or so percent of the public that strongly favors abortion rights. How do you think they handled that issue in the primary, and what does that say for how things will look in the general?
I'll jump in first here. I think it feeds into this idea that I think Republicans have been happily kind of beating the drum on of everything's fine, except for we're going to oppose everything that might not make it fine, in this divorced from reality narrative of as long as we hold the line, it can't get worse. And we're not actively participating in that. And at the same time, 65% plus, 78% plus, of the actual electorate are saying, we are totally on the other side of this issue than you, and you've missed the boat. And it doesn't take much for a voter to look at candidates, frankly, like Reagan Dunn, who have that record, or others who have, public statements like Matt Larkin, to say, actually, you've not done that. You've not done anything. You've chosen not to take an action here. And I think Kim Schreier was expertly deploying her messaging on the other end of that by, whether it was her TV ads or her radio spots, and her visibility were always spot on, bringing in the Republican mayors of Wenatchee, the mayors of Issaquah, highlighting the fact that she was on the ground being active, right? Not playing into the Republicans' assumption that voters would just be defense oriented.
Yeah, and she's been active throughout her term on the ground and building those relationships and really delivering for the people in all of the areas of her district, which I think a lot of people questioned initially. Hey, is she going to represent all of us? Is she going to get out to the various counties? Is she comfortable in this really diverse district that is both urban, suburban, and rural, and that stretches, nearly from the coast to the mountains? it is really an interesting district, and kind of a microcosm of the state, and she seems to have navigated that very well. So I think we will proceed to a number of the legislative district races, and we'll start with a few. I think overall it's fair to say that Democrats finished very strongly. Certainly at the beginning of this cycle, there was a lot of excitement from Republicans here in the state legislatively, and concern from Democrats saying, hey, this could be a tough year. We have a lot of seats that we may need to be defending. We've got redistricting. We're not knowing how that's going to turn out. And so is this going to be a year where Democrats potentially lose a number of seats? It's a midterm that a lot of times is challenging for the party in power. Just that's the way it's traditionally gone. And these results turned out pretty favorably for Democrats across the board. I guess thinking about things overall before we get into specific districts, are there thoughts that you have, Doug, on just how things look for Democrats across the board legislatively?
I think we can pretty safely say that Democrats are still going to have control of the state legislature. There might be a swing of, a seat or two in either direction, and that can include Democrats getting more seats, which, if you believe all of the coverage but leading into this election, it was just a lot of reprinted Republican press releases about how there was a wave coming and, you better tremble. They might lose a seat or two, but given where they're at right now, which is, if you haven't following along, that's 57 to 41 advantage in the House. It's a large advantage in the House. And then the Senate, there is a 28 to 21 advantage for Democrats. So they got a little cushion. So if they lose a seat or two, there becomes a little bit more of a headache from time to time as far as whipping the votes. But, they're ultimately still setting the agenda, controlling the committees. So, at the end of the day, the hope of controlling one of those chambers and stopping all this string of legislation. And, Crystal, I know we've criticized the Democrats here and there for some of the stuff they weren't able to get done. But let's take a moment to acknowledge that there has been a pretty steady stream of major legislation coming from this last few years of having, Inslee in the governor's seat and having both chambers controlled, that, including major climate bill and including a major transportation package. Neither of them are perfect, but they're definitely a lot better than doing nothing. Anyway, I think I don't know if that's partially a reflection of voters realizing, hey, this is working out decently for us to let one party with a fairly clear vision and passion for what they're doing lead things, and then on this other side we have a pretty honestly all over the place message, and other times just really simple, like to the point of ad nauseum, like just hating taxes every time. Like, well, sometimes we have to pay for stuff. So I think it's a favorable result, and it'll be interesting to see some of those close races actually end up coming the Democrats' way.
Yeah. Any thoughts that you have, EJ?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about what it must be like to be J.T. Wilcox right now, right? The man who's running the Republican House strategy, the guy who's raising all this money in his caucus for what purpose? And I kept believing that the strategy would become clear, right? That we were going to get indications of how all that money was going to be used on that side. And ultimately, they might as well just put that in a vault and set the vault off to the ocean, given it a Viking funeral, right? Because it did not produce. And there is nothing more damning in politics than being able to spend that much money with no results. And so I think the big takeaway for me, looking at these legislative races, and I largely agree with Doug, is that Democrats who had controlled both chambers and the governor's office for so long and had really legitimate critique around not delivering on the biggest issues for Washington for many years from all sides, passed some big stuff and started to do big things. And voters rewarded them by bucking what was supposed to be a very bad year for them. And so I hope that at least many of those Democrats, especially the incumbents, maybe who aren't on the ballot this year, are watching that going, okay, here's the data point. Let's keep going. Let's do more and see if this holds, if voters will continue to reward us for delivering on the things that we know are important to them.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And to your point, to both of your points, they have taken some substantive moves, particularly at a time. I mean, we're seeing some significant action taken congressionally recently, that they're just making some progress with some major legislation. But even on issues that federally Congress has been stuck on, our state legislature has been able to act and move. Things like a $35 cap on insulin for families was something that was passed by Democrats this past session. As you just talked about, Doug, record investments in transportation and transit and mobility and helping people be able to safely get through their communities and handle their daily tasks, even if they don't drive. And even, areas where, hey, there's highway expansion that may be a little bit controversial. They moved on an issue that had been stuck for over a decade, and getting through and getting past the I-5 bridge connection between Washington and Oregon. And so it is something where they have done some big things. They do appear to have been rewarded, particularly those that have stood strong. And there was, I think, a question in some of these swing districts that have gone between Democrats and Republicans that have been repeatedly extremely close, whether Republicans were going to be able to land some arguments that stuck, whether some of those criticisms from a couple years ago or 4 years ago were still valid today. And it seems like they fell flatter than they have for a long time. So I think just starting with a few legislative districts, starting with a big focus in the Senate, which I know Republicans were looking at as one of their potential biggest pickups in the Senate, where the margin is closer than it is in the House, in the 26th legislative district, down on the Kitsap Peninsula, with Senator Emily Randall facing a very strong challenge initially from Republican Jesse Young, who is a state representative running for that Senate seat. And Emily has finished really, I think, stronger than most people anticipated. I think this is one of those races where Republicans, to your point, EJ, invested a ton of money. Jesse Young was one of the biggest fundraisers, outspent Emily Randall. But Emily finished with over 50% of the vote. She's at 51.5% right now to Jesse Young's 44.3%. Certainly not the result that Republicans were looking for. And I think, frankly, a better result than Democrats were expecting. What happened in this race, and why do you think Emily finished so strongly, Doug?
Yeah, I mean, I think basically that part of the state, which is, just across the Tacoma Narrows Bridge from Tacoma, it's behaving a lot more like part of the Seattle metropolitan area. And, that means I think just generally it's shifting to the left. And there's a lot of specific things, like there was a sort of the big thing they were going to try to hit Emily on was they wanted to, lower the toll on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. And that ended up being a huge football this session. But ultimately, Democrats got to a place where they were okay with slightly moderating that toll. And, maybe there was some thought that left them vulnerable, but it appears that if that was going to be their dark horse issue or whatever, voters kind of went, well, that seemed like the responsible thing to do. I mean, you still do have to pay for that bridge and you have to pay for roads in general. You can't just suddenly go, everything's free. As much as we would love that means it's coming out of sales tax and other even more aggressive sources that are farther from the use case. So, I guess that I just bring that up since I do focus on transportation issues a lot, but I do think that, getting around the district is a big one. And they did get a upgrade to the Gorst interchange as well in the transportation bill. And, you know, as urbanists, we maybe don't love that widening, but in that district, solving that bottleneck for them might have been something they look at. Randall, you know, she's getting stuff done. And, you know, certainly we already talked about abortion, but I think in that district, it's likely to be a very big issue that's, you know, motivating turnout. You know, with Jesse Young being a pretty extreme right, you know, Republican, that's just not a good matchup as they maybe thought it was on paper, just because he has name ID from being a representative and raising a lot of money. Like, at the end of the day, it's just not maybe the right messenger or the right message. So you know, it's not a gimme by any means. She has 51.5%, I think, something you said. But that's certainly a good, strong position to be into. And barring some sort of real stumble, I think she'll get reelected, and rightfully so.
Yeah, and helping a potential seatmate in the representative open seat currently there, Addison Richards, the Democrat, also finishing with just over 50% against Spencer Hutchins, the Republican candidate. And I think particularly with Spencer, you know, they tried to paint him as pragmatic, just worried about what people would call kitchen table issues traditionally. I think people talk about a lot at the kitchen table, including issues of values and rights, but really tried to focus on an economic message. They certainly tried to hit Emily Randall when it came to taxes. They were also talking about gas prices. And I think there was a recognition that, one, it kind of, as they talked about with Biden sometimes, like, this is a bigger problem than just Washington State or even the United States when it comes to gas prices. There are some other major geopolitical forces at play there that influence that. And I think, as you mentioned, Doug, it's not that most people are actually anti-tax. They just want to get their money's worth, I think, is the bottom line. And I think with a number of the things that Emily Randall, that Democrats have really talked about being important to invest in, people are feeling that money is being spent in the ways that they feel is valuable and useful, and they can see a case to be made for that. What do you see in this district, or what do you think this says about just kind of competitive districts overall, EJ?
Well, I'll start by, I think every time we talk about Jesse Young, we also have to talk about the fact that he was barred from talking to his own legislative assistants by, you know, the legislature. This is a man who faced credible and serious allegations of being hostile and intimidating to staff. You know, this is also a man who mixed his professional staff with his campaign staff and was campaigning with state resources on state time. So, you know, every opportunity,
which is illegal, which you cannot do.
So had to get that in there because good government is important. The second thing is, like, the 26th gives me big 30th LD circa 5-6 years ago vibes. This is a pattern where we gradually saw Federal Way, that region, transfer to a much more solidly Democrat district, or at least more reliably Democrat district, than we have. I think we're watching in real time the 26th make a similar transition. Probably not apples to apples, but it's close enough where we're seeing this trend line of more Democrats consistently showing up and our candidates, regardless of fundraising ability, doing better and better. That is not to take anything away from Emily, because that woman is a rock star, right? She is working really hard. She is in the field, and she's actually addressing the least sexy issues of many districts, right? It is the retail politics of where are your sidewalks? Let's talk about the farmer's market. Let's talk about land use in your neighborhood and the park down the street. And unlike many other legislators, this is something that's popping up again and again on her socials and in her campaign ads and how she is moving through the world. So I think this is a case of an incredibly hardworking Democrat incumbent who is earning potentially this reputation of somebody who can hold super hard districts and I think raise a bunch of money at the same time. While she may have been outraised, she's pulling in sizable donations and has been a consistent I think, player in her caucus.
Yeah, that's dead on. And I just want to add in quick too that, in addition to her just being clearly a rising star in the party, this district now has a fast ferry to Seattle, and it's close to Tacoma. I mean, this is a place where people are going to escape really high housing prices in Seattle. That is where the working class is moving, and that's where your barista lives, maybe. So it's certainly some place where it's easy to see that trend continuing, because Bremerton is building a good amount of housing. They're kind of embracing that to some extent, and that's going to change who's in the district. It's going to be a younger district for that reason.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, Bremerton has, Gig Harbor has made important strides on zoning, housing action, building enough housing to house the people who are moving there, who are living there, and really taking steps to address the housing affordability crisis that we've been seeing, and making progress in those conversations and taking action in ways that I think is surprising sometimes to people in Seattle, and that Seattle is lagging behind areas in Pierce County and in Spokane when it comes to taking definitive steps to build more housing supply, address the housing crisis, and move there. It's really interesting. I completely agree that this does remind me of the 30th legislative district around the Federal Way, Auburn area of a few years back, of the early to mid 20-teens that we saw there, and that it is progressively coming more blue. And I do think that is because we're seeing a lot more people displaced really from Seattle and more expensive areas to those areas, discovering, how they are. Those areas are organically growing also. And so we're seeing a number of the Pierce County suburbs shift to be a little bit more blue, as well as suburbs in King County. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon that we're seeing, which we might as well move to the 30th legislative district results. This was another really interesting district, especially with redistricting. A lot of people wondering, is this going to be a district that's a challenge? There's been a lot of talk about public safety. There's been a lot of talk about economic issues. And this is another area where Republicans invested a lot of money and tried to attack the Democrats in this district for taking action that was popularly supported by voters in the district before, seems to have been a vindicating vote in that area, where Claire Wilson is at 54% ahead of Linda Kochmar, who is a known Republican name in the area. Jamila Taylor finishing above 54% against Casey Jones, who's actually a policeman, an officer in the area. And then with an open seat, the one vacated by Representative, or that's being vacated by Representative Jesse Johnson, Christine Reeves, who is a former state representative who left to run for Congress and now is running again for this seat, finished with just shy of 43%. And that was a competitive Democratic primary. So between Christine Reeves, 43% just about, Carrie Anderson, the other Democrat in the race, at just about 14%, a really strong Democratic showing in that seat against the Republican who made it through to the general election with 37% of the vote. 55+% is what people would love to see. This used to be a district with Republicans there, very purple, not reddish purple. That is just continued to move solidly blue. I think to that point, you have legislators here with Jamila Johnson, who's the head of the Black Legislative Caucus, and Senator Wilson, who are great retail politicians, great in the community, doing the work on the ground to get this through. What does this result say to you, starting with EJ?
I mean, at the risk of being a little too snarky, I think what this says is Federal Way and Auburn love a good repeat candidate. We've got Linda Kochmar, who has run how many times now? We've got Christine Reeves coming back to serve in the House. And by no means is it like a single value on any of these also-rans and multiple-time candidates. It is that, one, the bench there is producing the same types of candidates, but the difference is that the Democrats are doing better every time, right? These are not radically different candidates that have been running in the past. What I'm interested in is you've got Representative Johnson, who had done incredible work on criminal justice reform. Voters clearly were not buying the hype from the media on just how controversial this must have been, when it's actually not. That would have been borne out in the vote share. That is a clear correlation. There would have been some level of backlash. I think the other piece here is that turnout was not good in that region. And when you look at King County overall, and you look at who's voting specifically in the 30th LD, there is much work to be done. And so while, it is impressive that Democrats are putting up 54 plus in each of these races, I don't think they can rest. And I think that if they do, while I don't think it's enough for the GOP to come back and pull one of these seats, it would be a disservice to the nearly decade of massive investments that caucus and the party has made in that region, that is full of renters, that is full of young families, and people that, to Doug's point earlier, escaping housing prices, who are sandwiched between Tacoma and Seattle now. So I think it's a fascinating place with lots to watch still.
Very fascinating. A ton to watch. You are absolutely correct. Turnout there in many areas in South King County really is bad. It's poor. And everyone has to do a much better job of engaging voters where they're at. We have to meet them on their doors. We have to meet them in the community. We have to do the work to make sure that we're reaching out to everyone and listening and hearing what they need, what's concerning to them, what they're saying is needed in their neighborhoods and their communities, and responding and addressing that to make sure that government and their representation is relevant to them. I think there's work to be done there, and just the continued communication. So I think this is certainly one where, I agree that it probably is not going to flip, but a lot of work just needs to be done in the community. And the more the community is engaged and galvanized, the more they're going to be able to do and lead. This seems like such an opportunity in this district, where sometimes we look at, for Democrats, the Seattle districts and say, okay, this is a safety seat. These people can lead on groundbreaking policy, on things that we know are the right thing to do, and that just need more proofs of concept, more data from implementations on the ground, and people can say, okay, they implemented it there. It wasn't scary. The sky didn't fall. We can expand this. We've seen that with $15 an hour minimum wage. We've seen that with a lot of paid leave legislation, even renter protections in federal way. They were among the leaders in passing a local initiative there that then we saw replicated across the state and legislative action taken on. So I just see this as such a district of opportunity if they really can engage and connect with the community to be able to do that. Another very interesting district is the 47th legislative district, which is half of Kent, Covington, Maple Valley, parts of Auburn. Again, a very purple district, one where that sees 2 open seats, an incumbent remaining in Representative Deborah Intiman, but an open Senate seat after Mona Doss announced that she was leaving, and an open House seat after Pat Sullivan retired. And so we had competitive Democratic and Republican primaries going on here with open seats, just a lot of questions about what is going to happen here in the 47th. Very hard to predict. But we saw some really interesting results. Again, this is one of the districts that Republicans said was one of their top targets, definitely in the top 2 or 3 targets that they felt were there for pickups, and turning these seats that were held by Republican incumbents, and 2 of them now open seats, into Republican pickups. And what we saw was in the one seat with Deborah Intiman, she finished comfortably with 55% against a Republican candidate, Kyle Lebedev. There was another Republican contesting in the race, but Deborah made it through fairly comfortably. We had a Senate race with Satwinder Carr and Claudia Kaufman as Democrats against Bill Boyce, the Republican. Bill Boyce, who is a city council member in the city of Kent, a Republican, also a Black Republican that's running here, has 45%, 45.58%. And then a very, very, very close race between Claudia Kaufman and Satwinder Carr. Currently, Claudia Kaufman is leading with 27.23% over Satwinder with 27.02%. This is a race that is under 100 votes separating the two. And it looks like Claudia Kaufman is going to squeeze and squeak through here. This is a really interesting race. And again, you look at the combined percentage of the Democratic vote, they're like 54% there. That's a great result that we see on the Democratic side. But wow, what a really closely contested race. And then in the other seat, we saw two Democrats, Chris Stearns with 33.4% against Shukri Olo, another Democrat who is making it through, both Democrats making it through the primary, Shukri with 19.6% against three Republicans. One of, again, a party pick for the Republicans, Carmen Goers, raised $200,000 in the primary, spent the bulk of it. She actually finished in last place. This was another Black Republican here with two other Republican white male opponents who finished with 15.1% and 17.4%, respectively, with Ted Cook and Barry Knowles. Very interesting result. I don't know that many people, I certainly did not call that there was going to be a Democratic shutout in one of these seats in this purple district, or that the other results looked so strong in favor of the other ones. What do you see when you see this 47th legislative district race, Doug?
Yeah, you can't get any bigger whiff than not even making it to the primary. So having two Democrats in that position 2 seat, that is going to be an exciting race, but not for the Republicans, I guess. But we'll circle back to that because I do want to talk about that race more. But I suppose we should talk about the other races more a little bit too. I mean, Mona Das retiring, I think that certainly led to some nervousness that we're not going to have the incumbent advantage. And that didn't seem to be an issue, with the result. It does look like it'll be Claudia Kaufman. So again, an established name, but someone I think who seemed to do a good job. So it's someone I'm actually glad to see coming back. I mean, I'm always thrilled when you get, people who keep going back for many decades. But I think that one is an exception. But yeah, in going back to the 30th as well, on the Democratic side, I guess over all those years of not having that many Black, and apologies for my cat making all that noise, not having that many Black candidates, I guess the assumption was they would do worse than the white candidates that people were putting forward, or just maybe wasn't even a thought. But it's pretty clear that those Black candidates are doing just as good as any of the white candidates, if not better, because we see these results in the 30th and in the 47th and all across really the metro area, where we're seeing voters really resonating with these folks. So if anything, it appears to be an asset. Yeah, I mean, it just clearly is a district that is slipping away from Republicans, and they don't seem to be doing very much to fix that. And as you mentioned, Carmen Goers finishing 5th when she had the support of the party at, I think, all levels. And then additionally, she had the Seattle Times endorsement, which didn't appear to be worth the paper it was written on, which I don't know if that's true of every race. But in the 47th, that's a really embarrassing finish for the Seattle Times. And as EJ alluded to, a Viking funeral for $200,000 worth of cash. That's got to be one of the only times that's happened in Washington history that a candidate has raised $200,000 in a primary and then finished 5th, at least at the state legislature level.
Yeah, absolutely. What did you see here, EJ?
I think one of the most exciting things for me is that this actually might be the first time where we have two Native people representing the same district in the House in Washington State. And I think that is incredible. The opportunity and the history-making moment of those candidates' ascension, if they are the victors in November, I really think that is the underreported takeaway of this cycle, in that these are two candidates, although one has, both of them are previously elected in other offices. Like, that's a big deal, right? On the other end of that spectrum, it is wildly confusing to me, the uneven field game that has occurred in the 47th, right? We have some candidates who were deeply knocking on doors every weekend, huge volunteer turnout, and then we have some candidates who really focused on media and focused on really traditional electronic, I don't even know if that's the way to put it, traditional electronic, but they weren't at the doors, they weren't making a ton of phone calls, and they were pretty open about it. So I think there's a lot of questions to be answered in terms of how and how people got through and the vote share. So when you're looking at the position 2 with Shukri and Chris, Shukri outraised Chris and really produced not very many votes for that. And when you look at the per dollar spend on per vote, it doesn't really the math doesn't quite work out the way you would expect. Now, a D-on-D race in that is going to be pretty, there will be fireworks, right? Because you have to make up a considerable amount of points, and the clock is reset for both of those candidates. So I'm watching them really closely. I'm excited. I think they're both great candidates. I think they're both folks who, as they move towards the general, are going to start to distinguish themselves to voters. I think when you look at that Senate race, I cannot help but think, if I was a Republican strategist and fundraiser, I would have wanted to pour a lot more money into that race, supporting a Black Republican versus some of the white Republicans, which received much higher proportions of spend from caucus accounts and from PACs associated with Republicans. So, there's probably some obvious reasons for that on that side that don't need to go too much into depth on, but it is shocking that in a three-way race, the Republican still only musters 45%.
Yeah, I think that's all valid. And I even think, actually, in this district, in the 47th, it has been an interesting one. This is actually, I live near the border of the 47th, the 47th and the 33rd district border. And in the 47th, actually, we've traditionally seen Black candidates, visibly non-Christian candidates, whether it's someone with a hijab or a turban, underperform compared to spend a number of times here. And so it's interesting to see these results come through. I don't know, what role that played on the Republican side also, but that's just another dynamic in this race that has been interesting. I do think that this sets up just for the candidates that are there, that are going to be in the general, a really interesting matchups and comparisons. And I do think that Democrats, all of the Democrats in these races, do need to be out on the doors, do need to work through the general. Certainly a favorable result in the primary, but another one where they can't rest at all and need to continue to push forward. But one where I think, this was an area where people were wondering, hey, where's the public safety conversation going to be? And are Republicans going to be able to land some hits here? And are people, hyper worried about inflation? I think, yet again, in this district, I think people saw that the conversation on public safety on the ground is a lot more nuanced than it is in the media, I think is safe to say. So many times we hear the conversation between like more cops and back the blue and, hey, no candidates are actually running on this, FYI, but like defund everything. There's not actually a candidate saying that right now, but the perception is out there that has been there, and people aren't there. Even people who favor more police, who are not bothered by more police, are saying, but what we really need are behavioral health services, our substance use disorder, addiction treatment services, our housing for people. We have to address these root causes. If there's an issue with someone who is going through a crisis, police just don't have the tools to solve that. I think that's pretty universally acknowledged and not a controversial statement. And when polling goes beyond just some very basic questions and probes into those, we repeatedly see the public saying, yeah, of course we need those things. And so it was very interesting to see some of these attacks, whether it's in the 30th or, throughout the state, in the 47th on those issues, and they just kind of fell flat. And even on the inflation issue, people are worried and people are absolutely squeezed, but looking at, okay, so what are you going to do about it? And I think Democrats told a better story about, okay, here's the plan. This is what we plan to invest in, and this is how we plan to help. I think working people felt that Democrats had a plan that was more tailored to their needs from Democrats. So just an interesting result that we saw there.
Yeah.
We will pivot a bit to the Seattle races, which are different than all of these battleground races that we've been talking about. And these are in the city of Seattle, Democrat versus Democrat races. We saw a number of open seat races that have happened here. And so we can start with the 36th district, which had a pretty stark and conclusive result, I think, in the open seat race that was there, where there was a contested primary that had 5 Democratic candidates there, different shades of there, from more progressive to probably on the most moderate end with Waylon Robert. But we saw Julia Reed, who received the Seattle Times and the Stranger endorsement, take 55% of the vote, followed by Jeff Manson, who is making it through the primary with 13.5% of the vote. And then followed by Nicole Gomez, Waylon Robert, and Elizabeth Tyler Crone. Looks like that is a, race that is Julia's for the taking, I think, realistically, just looking there. And certainly benefited from both the Times and the Stranger endorsement. There's another race in the 37th in South Seattle where Chapalo Street got both the Stranger and the Times endorsement, but that was a much closer race where we saw Chapalo with 41% of the vote, 41.53, and Amijah Smith making it through the primary with 35.37% of the vote, a much closer race. We saw in the 46th legislative district, Daria Farivar make it through in first place. The progressive candidate in the race, she currently has 31.61% of the vote, and Leilak Rave finishing in second, making it through the primary at 28.06% of the vote. And then we saw in the 34th legislative district, in that open seat there, Emily Alvarado with 54% of the vote to Leah Griffin's 31.2%. I'll kick this off as we discuss kind of these Seattle races at large. It's been talked about so many times before, how in Seattle, how consequential the Seattle Times and the Stranger endorsements are. On a previous post-primary recap, Michael Charles, put it very succinctly, saying there are 2 political parties in Seattle, the Seattle Times and the Seattle Stranger. And, actually went back and looked at the numbers, and for races in the city of Seattle, for legislative districts in Seattle, for candidates on the ballot, for the past decade, candidates endorsed by the Stranger have made it through to the primary 100% of the time. It actually seems like, particularly for progressive candidates, the path requires going through the Stranger, requires that endorsement to make it on to the general. How consequential is that? And what do you think we saw overall in general in these races, Doug?
Yeah, I think that Stranger endorsement, it's really huge, particularly in a primary in Seattle. That I think the 46 is where we really saw the test of that. In Seattle, the the Urban Selections Committee, which I'm a member of, is, lucky enough to talk to most of the candidates. And when people skip, usually it's a sign that they're either running that centrist lane, or they just got, the race together so late that they didn't really have their, time or it together enough to respond. But we agreed with the Stranger and the Seattle Times with Julia Reed. I think there's a unique case where there's just a candidate that was so just polished, and the other candidates had some promise, but there just weren't really a compelling case to say, but why not Julia Reed? And I think that's a testament to running a really good race and being a good candidate. And hopefully everyone's right about that, because I don't think you see all three of us agree very often. In the 46, on the other hand, we did end up endorsing Melissa Taylor and really liked what she brought to the table on housing. But we were also really thought that Daria Farivar was a fantastic candidate as well, and particularly around the issues of transportation, being policy director at Disability Rights Washington, which is a great partner of us and a great leader on all these climate and climate justice issues at the state level and the local level. So we were happy with both candidates, and great to see Daria go through and being several points ahead of Lilac, where we didn't get a chance to talk to her, and I think she's more in the Sarah Nelson lane of the party who endorsed her, if you will. So how that race shakes out will have I think pretty big bearing on just what is possible on some issues like housing, where it seems like someone like Rave is sort of staking out a very moderate position there and not really being upfront about, hey, like, we need to do something about exclusionary zoning. We need to make our zoning more inclusive and be able to fit more people into parts of the city where East Seattle is so wealthy, so much opportunity, so many good schools and good parks and everything, and it's a part of the city that's kind of pulled up the drawbridge a little bit. Maybe she will change her tune on that position a little bit. But I think, although Daria didn't talk about housing a lot, she's someone who on the questionnaire was pretty clear. She's on that same page around ending exclusionary zoning and promoting missing middle. So it's an issue that we track really closely. Polling shows that Washington voters are increasingly focused on that, and I think it's because people are smart. And you get that the whole world's experiencing inflation. You can't really blame one party for that. You maybe can blame Putin for that a little bit, but no one can control Putin. What are you going to do to help people control their costs? And the hugest thing is housing. It's a massive cost in our region, and if you don't have a solution that both gets at promoting affordable housing through investment, and also dealing with our zoning and policies that just make it really restrictive to create more housing, you're not really tackling that problem. And I think for some voters that's really starting to hit home, which could give a candidate like Daria the edge. And I will let EJ break down some of the other races, as I've gone on long enough, but it definitely was a reassuring result in that sense.
Yeah, so I appreciate being on a show with Doug, because Doug is so smart about so many things. And like, as he's talking, I'm like writing down things. And I'm like, oh, I need to look into some of that. For me, back to the question around endorsements and the power of the stranger, I think Michael Charles was absolutely right around the two-party system now. I also feel like it is incredibly disingenuous for anybody who works in politics to be surprised if the candidate who gets the stranger endorsement gets through. I think it shows a lack of context around just how much that means to people, both as a key part of many people's own political maturity within the city, right? Like, the stranger serves as this thing that people learn about Seattle from, learn how Seattle operates. And so discounting the weight of that endorsement, is done at one's own peril. I think we've gotten to this place, right? And many of these endorsements and many of the races, bear this out, right? Is that there are a couple of things at play. Media consolidation has removed many of the other endorsing organizations that are typically been seen as nonpartisan, right? We no longer have the Seattle PI. We no longer have many of the regional or neighborhood papers that were also doing this for many years. The lanes of engagement have also changed for people who are coming into elected office. The salaries that we pay people to do public service no longer match the cost of living in many of our cities. So therefore, you are narrowing the field more and more and more as this goes. I think the two remaining factors that I think of when you think about just the power of these of the Times and the strangers' endorsements are the policy hegemony, right? The lane in which we talk about policies is so locked in and narrow, right, in the full spectrum of possibility. So the process of differentiating, like, if we're looking at the 36th, 7 candidates, is it 2, 4, 6 candidates who have minor policy differences and may only sell that difference with enthusiasm or gusto differently, but are 99% aligned, is more and more difficult for voters to actually judge on policy versus performance. And I think that gets to the last piece here of like the opposition that is understood in Seattle politics has become more and more clear around there is the folks that are trying to do good and the folks that are trying to do bad. And the folks that are trying to do bad, I mean, when I started working in politics here, you could name 50 different organizations, 50 different people off the top of your head. And now it feels like every campaign has really locked in on the bad guys are, Amazon, the bad guys are the tech bros, the bad guys are X, Y, and Z, right? But it's really focused on small pockets of opposition. And for many reasons, some of those groups earn that label, I will say that. But in many ways, it limits the amount of discourse that happens. And I'm going on a little bit long, but I think it can't be overstated that many of these factors inform how we got to a place where 2 newspapers inform so much of our political success in the city.
Well, yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, the reason why Hacks and Wonks exist is because of the frustration with how narrow and shallow some of those conversations can be with so much consolidation and with the thinning of just the amount of people covering these races, the amount of visibility that races and policy have, the lack of accountability that we see with so many of our leaders, not just federally, but I mean, in the city of Seattle, we're still wondering what happened to text that disappeared at a really pivotal time in the city. So it is challenging to work through that and deal with that. And I just think that this is a time where I hope lots of community organizations lean in and engage and try to connect their own memberships, their own spheres of influence to the process. One thing that I found really exciting about these results that I haven't really seen talked about was, there's a lot of public polling available, but the primary is a spectacular actual public poll. And when we talk about inclusive zoning and making progress on affordable housing, the vast majority of voters in every single district from the 46th to the 37th voted in favor of candidates who said, we're taking on exclusive zoning. We're going to make it more inclusive. We're going to vote for that missing middle housing bill. And that spoke strongly in favor of it. That they voted overwhelmingly for candidates who talked about strengthening the social safety net, who talked about addressing behavioral health services, substance use disorder services, supportive housing and wraparound services, and not just focusing on we just need to lock people up and do what we've been doing that has landed us here today. They're really talking about addressing a lot of these root causes and taking substantive, not incremental, but pretty dynamic change in many of these areas. And voters were right there. So I think that was encouraging to see. And I would just wonder and hope that we're going to see that reflected and responded to throughout the general election. Full disclosure, I worked for Melissa Taylor. I've paid close attention to the 46th and a number of these races, and am excited to see a strong progressive get through in that race. And Daria Farivar, especially with a lot of the work that she's done in disability justice, which is critical. And so it's just going to be really interesting to see as these general election races go by. And I think the 37th legislative district looks like a very competitive race that could go either way right now, that it's going to be really interesting to hear in these opportunities where it's not quite a Democrat versus Republican conversation that does get flattened a lot, but hopefully we can get into some of the meatiness of issues. There's a lot of policy space in the Democratic arena, in the progressive arena, to really talk through what are your plans for fixing the issues that are challenging people? How do you plan to make people's lives easier and simpler? And you know, what are you going to stand up for? Where are your red lines? What are you going to lead on? Are really interesting and exciting things to see that I see there. So I think that, you know, the entire media ecosystem, from the urbanists playing a crucial role, the South Seattle Emerald, Real Change, just a lot of community media, community organizations have a lot of power just because there just aren't many people covering or talking about this. And this is an opportunity for them to talk about what's important to them, their members, people they serve, their community. And we need it now more than ever. I guess as we, you know, finish thinking about these Seattle races and just other races across the state, is there anything that you think is flying under the radar that's notable, or things that we haven't discussed tonight that you feel we should be paying attention to? And I will start with Doug.
Oh, so many things. I think, just to add another thought about the Seattle races is, you know, I think it was another case with Chief Street where we endorsed him as well, and I think that's another race for Seattle Times and Stranger, and we agreed. And I think that may have partially been advantage of him kind of having his game plan set when he announced, and it seemed like Elijah Smith was a little bit more like, you know, still trying to catch up, announcing a little bit later, I think. And we didn't get a chance to talk to her, so that was part of our decision. She didn't return a questionnaire, but you know, he was someone who was really good at talking about housing. So again, I think that fits the theme. And Emily Alvarado, you know, doing better than Leah Griffin, who we endorsed. But we like both candidates. We were very clear that, you know, two great options there. Like like someone with housing chops was doing a little better. So I don't know. I might be stretching this theme a little bit much, but it definitely seems like credibility in that issue is a huge asset. And that should be good news. I mean, unfortunately, you know, we're going to have people like Jerry Pollack getting reelected, but they might look at this and go, well, maybe I've been doing this a little bit wrong if I really want to continue getting reelected. But I guess one race we didn't talk a lot about, but we shouldn't shy away from the bad news, which is the 42nd did not go well for Democrats. You had a hope of a Senate pickup there, and it's still, you know, not completely impossible, but Sharon Schumack, who is the incumbent House representative, getting 47% in that district, you know, that's not a great result against two Republicans. And one of them did have kind of that name ID, Simon Sefkicker, however you say that. You know, that might have helped him, but it does look like he'll be the one through. So she'll continue to face that in the primary. And then we have actually two of those seats are Democratic held. So, you know, the people lower in the ticket did a little bit better. But, you know, these could be the two seats we lose. But I do think we make that up maybe in LD10, where Greg Gilday, the Republican incumbent, isn't doing well at all, is down like 4 points. And also in the 26th, as we've talked about a little bit, with having Addison Richard potentially being a pickup there, it might have kind of come out in the wash. But I don't know what's going on in the 42nd. I kind of thought that district was drifting a little bit blue, but in the redistricting is really odd because it's such a huge district. All the changes kind of happened within the sort of Bellingham scope. And I guess they must have just carved out a little bit of Bellingham that was sort of keeping that district where Schumack was winning. And it's also, I mean, I guess maybe Schumack wasn't as strong of a candidate as maybe some of her seatmate Alicia Rule doing a point and change better. I don't know if that's just the money in that race or what, or if it really should have been flip flopped. Who tried to grab that Senate seat, but it might have been for not if that district is just now kind of +3 or something Republican. You really have to run a really good race maybe to win that, and with Republicans pouring money in there, it's not as favorable terrain, which kind of brings us back to redistricting. Like, it's a weirdly drawn district, and I guess we left it that way, but why? So maybe I'll leave it at that for now and let others jump in.
Go ahead, EJ.
I think I'll start with the 42nd. I think this is a district that is an opportunity for Democrats to begin with, right? Like, if it were not for the death of conspiracy theorist, COVID denying Doug Erickson, who loved to work for dictators, I think we wouldn't even be in this situation. So any Democrat who is putting up numbers right now, it was an uphill battle. And I think that the points are valid around just how hard that was going to be for just about anybody, given the challenges of where the lines are going to be and all these things. I think in terms of other stuff that is top of mind for me is the real tragedy of Julie Anderson's run for Secretary of State. Incredible underperformance, not even carrying her own county of Pierce County, running as an independent against the incumbent Steve Hobbs, is something that I keep coming back to, where I'm like, all right, that does not make sense in my head yet. Given everybody's enthusiasm of keeping Steve Hobbs as far away as possible from actually legislating, that part does. But the lack of challenge to his ascension into the Secretary of State's office seems a bit odd. It is almost certain that a Democrat will hold that seat for the first time in 60 years, and I think that is something that is to celebrate. I think that is a good thing for Washington, even as oddly as we have arrived at that fact. Some of the other quick things on my list, as long as you're asking for that grab bag, I'll go back to the complete lack of strategy on the Republican side in terms of how they are planning on taking and building a majority in this state. Still, top of mind for me, it is the bright, shiny object of, like, are they going to produce a strategy at any point in the next decade? I don't know. And then lastly, where Democrats have made long-term investments, they are starting to yield the results and the rewards of that, whether that's Federal Way, whether that's in the 26th out in Gig Harbor. Democrats are getting those rewards for decisions and investments that they made 8 to 10 years ago. And the multiple cycle layering of those massive multi-million-dollar investments in voter turnout and improving the data on who lives in those areas and making the case to those voters is making their job easier. And when you look at places that have not enjoyed that investment, that are continually looked at as opportunities and pickups, especially when you're looking at the kind of demographics as destiny argument that gets made, we don't see perennial investments in places where there are large populations of color that are ascendant to majorities. We haven't seen the multi-layered approach in Yakima. We haven't seen that multi-layered approach in the Tri-Cities. And frankly, the results show Democrats are not moving forward in many of those primaries, and the lack of investment from the party shows. But where they have done it, it has been an incredible reward for them.
Completely agree. And with that, this recap comes to a close. I want to thank our panelists, EJ Juarez, Doug Trum, for their insight and making this an engaging and informative event. To those watching online, thanks so much for tuning in and for sending in questions. If you missed any of the discussion tonight, you can catch up on the Hacks and Wonks Facebook page or Twitter, where we're at Hacks Wonks. Special thanks to essential members of the Hacks and Wonks team and coordinators for this evening, Shannon Chang and Bryce Canatelli. If you missed voting in the primary, you still have time to make your voice heard in the general elections coming up on November 8th. If you need to register to vote, update your registration, or find information, you can go to myvote.wa.gov. And as a reminder, even if you've been previously incarcerated, your right to vote is restored, and you can re-register to vote immediately upon your release even if you are still under community supervision. So that's new this year. You can vote. If you are not currently incarcerated, you just need to re-register at myvote.wa.gov. Be sure to tune in to Hacks and Wonks on your favorite podcast app for our midweek interviews and our Friday weekend review shows, or at officialhacksandwonks.com. I've been your host, Crystal Fincher. See you next time.